In 1970s Denver, Colorado, USA, a serial killer was on the loose. Over the course of 2 years, 4 women had been brutally stabbed to death. When police failed to link the killings and separate investigations produced no suspects, the case went cold. The families of those victims would have to wait 40 years to find any kind of closure via an unlikely link between latest DNA profiling techniques and the 1981 killing of a rookie Denver cop. These are the crimes that took 4 decades to solve. This is the case of Joe Irvin. Hi and welcome back to True Crime with me, Emma Kenny. You may from time to time today see a little head poking up, which is Wookie. I promised Wookie he could spend the next few hours with me filming this. So if you see a little hairy thing walking around, do not be concerned. It is a dog and not a strange part of me. If you're new to this channel and you think, what's she going on about? I release my crime content on a Wednesday and a Sunday religiously. Crime and consistency is key, and you will always find it on this channel. As ever, thanks for all your support, guys. Adore you. Subscribe if you haven't yet. Give me a like, give me a comment, get involved, and thanks to all my subs on Patreon and YouTube membership. Can't do this without you, so many, many thanks. Today's case is one of those cases that has taken such a long time to solve, and I know a lot of you won't have heard of it, and the reason that I'm telling it and giving it some legacy is because so often victims are forgotten, and families had to wait decades, literally, to have this resolved and to realise that the victims of these crimes had a killer associated with it, a level of sad closure, but nonetheless closure. So let's take a look at Joe Irvin, who he was, how he was formed, but of course, how it came about that a man who was completely under the radar for such a long time eventually was caught for his crimes. So let's go back to the 7th of December, 1978. We've got 33-year-old Madeline Fury Liviuday. Now, she is at home with her 2 young daughters. She's in Denver, Colorado. And this particular woman is really high flyer. She's an editor of a popular children's magazine. It's called Ranger Rick. She was also an incredibly talented nature writer. She was an author, an ecologist, a real all-round good human being. She had a massive passion for the natural world. Also, she was a really devoted wife and mother. She adored her 2 little girls. She had Molly and baby Ariel. They were literally her world. This woman was starting her life. She had everything to live for. She was passionate about her subject area, incredibly committed to her career, but fully devoted to this growing family. She was living the dream, she really was. Also, she was an incredibly good swimmer. She'd actually grown up in Florida. She was one of 5 girls. And what her family described her as is somebody who was vibrant. She had a really curious spirit. She was a fearless adventurer, and she absolutely loved traveling with her work. And she'd been afforded that opportunity to travel. So she'd been to Africa, she'd been to Europe. We're talking about a real independent individual here, a real go-getter, ambitious but very balanced when it came down to her family commitments. And she was really happy with her life. She had an incredibly bright future. I mean, just the things that I've talked about so far, you automatically can see that this is a woman who knew who she was, knew where she was going, and was loving driving her life forward. So we go back to this morning that we're talking about. This is December. So it's coming up for Christmas. Just want you to think about where you are as a young mum when you're coming up to Christmas. You've got that sense of excitement. You've got the twinkles everywhere you go because of the lights people put in trees, and the shops are full of that Christmas messaging. It's one of those idyllic times when you have a young family. She's just going about her business. She's feeding her children breakfast. And then there's a knock at the door. And just like a million times, we've all gone and answered that door. Why wouldn't we? It's breakfast time. She answers the door. And then a man who's armed with a knife just forces his way in. Imagine how terrifying that would be for her. She's got children there. You can't even begin to envisage the level of fear and anxiety and stress that would be encountered in that moment, knowing that her own children are being fed breakfast and now there is a dangerous man in her home. He forces her into the bedroom and then he just repeatedly stabs her. Her body was found later on by her husband. He came in from work to that. Absolutely no rhyme, no reason, no understanding. Just a woman who's so loved, snuffed out in such a cold way. Her children left for that day, not aware that their own parent had been horrifically killed in their home. Then we get to the morning of the 10th of August 1980, and we have 53-year-old Dolores Burrajes, and she's found dead in an alley, and this is in the 500 block of East 17th Avenue in Denver. So she had been walking to work, just going to work at the Fairmont Hotel. This is what she did. She worked in the cafeteria. So she's just doing what so many of us do, just going through the motions of your daily life, just walking to work, not even thinking that anything dangerous could possibly happen. And then she finds herself in a situation where she's not just attacked, she's stabbed multiple times. And then her attacker, well, they just drag her body and they just dump it like rubbish behind buildings. Her body was found around 7 a.m. or just after. Dolores had literally just been in Denver to visit her family for the summer. So they just had this really nice time together. And she was really, really loved by that family. She was a much loved wife, a much loved mother, a much loved grandmother. And what's incredibly sad, and again, sliding doors moments, you can say that for everything, but I really mean it. When you see these scenarios play out and unfold and you're like, wow, how it would have been if she'd flown home that day, because actually it was the last day of work before she was due to travel back to her home in El Paso, Texas. So essentially, she's in this scenario where she was gonna go back and see her family, and it was her last day of work, and if only she'd finished that day of work one day earlier, this would never have played out. She'd never have been that victim. But again, this horrific randomness of this attack out of nowhere. Then we get to the 21st of December, again, 1980. This is just 4 months after Dolores has been murdered. We find the body of 27-year-old Gwendolyn Harris, also found in a Denver street. So this is really, really unusual, guys. We've got 2 bodies now turning up in a Denver street of these women. So her body's found around 10:45 a.m. And again, if you're an investigator, no matter what's going on around you, you're going to realize that this is highly unusual. We don't expect women on the way to work or just walking down the street being horribly murdered randomly. That sparks and strikes that there is some particular individual with a particular MO doing that. But it doesn't seem to get picked up in any way. Now, she was found in the Montebello neighborhood, but she'd actually last been seen alive the night before, and she'd been at one of her favorite haunts. It's called the Polo Club Lounge. But again, as I said, we're now looking at a scenario where, just like the other victims, she's had multiple stab wounds. So this is telling. 3 women, totally vulnerable, all being stabbed in a similar fashion, out of nowhere. That should be adding up seriously in the investigators' minds. And this woman was, just like the other victims, a really much loved individual. She was a mom, a sister, a daughter. She was an aunt. She was a granddaughter. She was a niece. Her family said that she was an absolutely fantastic human, a bright, soft-spoken, athletic woman. Apparently, she was always smiling. She was just always really bright in her manner. And now she's dead, killed in the most heinous of way. And it takes my breath away that I am telling this story about these murders that happen pretty much immediately after one another, because we should be screaming about the possibility of a serial killer being on the loose right now. So it's the 24th of January 1981, another body is found, body of 17-year-old Antoinette Parks. And her body was actually found by bin men. And again, it just kind of really makes me feel about how this killer just disposed of these women's bodies as if they were rubbish, used for the purposes and then discarded. And the fact that bin men find her in a field just really adds to that feeling. So she's found in the area of 64th Avenue and Broadway. That's in Adams County. Again, she's been stabbed multiple times, 23 times. And it's impossible to make it any worse. It really is what I'm telling you. But she was 6 months pregnant at the time of her death. And when you're 6 months pregnant, it's obvious. People can see that you're pregnant. And it's also really important to point out that this monster who murdered this mum-to-be, they actually tried to cause damage to the baby. He actually inserted a stick and thrust it inside her. And so it looks like they were specifically targeting the child as well, wanted to make sure that the child died. Now, Antoinette had been a student at the Gateway High School in Aurora, and that's where she'd sung in a choir, but she'd dropped out because she was pregnant. And we have to remember that it's quite difficult to be a young mum, particularly when you go through with a pregnancy. You know, you're dealing with a lot of social confines and belief systems and prejudice. And certainly the time that we're talking about when she was pregnant and Antoinette found herself in that situation, it would be very difficult. She was, though, planning to go back to actually complete her education after she gave birth. Antoinette was the youngest of 6, and she grew up in Denver. She loved singing, she loved music. She was apparently really, really good with kids. So when her family used to future focus and imagine what Antoinette would do with her life, they always anticipated that she'd work in childcare or education, just something that meant that she was surrounded by children who she absolutely loved. But she never got the chance. She never got the chance. The day that she was actually killed, she had gone and visited her older boyfriend at his home. But look, when you're stressed and pregnant and things are tough, you can find yourself in conflict, can't you, with partners, and they can be in conflict with you. And essentially they started having an argument. She'd done the classic, just stormed off. I mean, how many times have we all done that when we're young? Everything feels so enormous and you just want to get away and let them know how upset and hurt you are. And it's all about so that you can repair it later on. It's like an action to create a reaction to hopefully affect change. And that's what she does. And little could she know that when she stormed off, that would be the last time her boyfriend saw her. It was the last time she was seen alive. And actually it was one of her brothers and her stepdad that had to identify her body. Her sisters, her older sisters, they actually went ahead before she was buried, before the funeral, and they washed her body. They looked after her. And they did that in spite of her injuries being so horrific, so profoundly disturbing, that the casket had to be closed. There was no opportunity for people who loved her to come and say goodbye and kiss her face one last time. That was denied them. But her sisters just wanted to show the tender loving care that they felt towards her. And I think that takes incredible bravery. I'm sure many of you have gone and seen people who have died, and I'm sure for some of us it can be comforting. For others, including myself, it's been quite traumatic at times. But what I would say is I myself have put makeup on my best friend when she died, and somebody that was very important to me, Hilda, when I lost her, and I put makeup on them. And it's kind of that last service that you get to do. It's the last tender moments that you have with their body. And even though you know that they're not present anymore, it's not a duty, it's a privilege. But I do not think for 1 minute it would be something that would be easy or even palatable to actually bathe the body of a sister who's been so badly mutilated and attacked by this heinous, malevolent creature that's taken her life. To hold those memories, the pictures, the moments captured and burned into your brain, into your mind because of the injuries that she suffered, to be willing to do that, It just speaks volumes about how much she was loved. It also speaks volumes as to why they literally as a family never recovered. Apparently, the loss of her was something that just fractured the family entirely, and I fully understand why. So I've just outlined that 4 women have been brutally stabbed to death in Denver in little over 2 years. So in the area itself of Denver, you would imagine people would be going, wait a minute, let me just get this straight. There's 4 women that have been murdered in a really close proximity. They've all been killed in the same way. Surely we're looking for a perpetrator who is a serial killer. But at this point, the authorities just were not hunting a serial killer at all. In fact, each murder was investigated entirely separately. They'd failed to recognise the link. Now, I can absolutely, with respect, forgive them on the forensic front, of course. You know, it's the age before DNA analysis, for example. So you appreciate that they might not be able to gather information from the scenes of the crime that link one another, which we would do today. We'd be able to take materials from each crime, and often we can find materials that link to each crime. Even something as simple as, because we're human, we tend to wear things that are pretty unique to us. We might not really think that we have a particular fashion style, but often we do. We wear things regularly, we have certain textures. So it can be that threads are left at the scene of a crime, or it will be that the knife itself is a particular type of knife, and so on and so forth. And of course, there's the obvious ones like bodily fluids, semen, saliva. But arguably, even nowadays, where DNA is concerned, it's often the way that we are as humans in our habits that means that they're able to commit their crimes in the way that they do, aside from, as I said, when there is analysis, because it's bodily, therefore it's automatic. Now, they didn't have that, so to speak, back then. But come on. It doesn't take anybody with any amount of knowledge to be able to realise that the same perpetrator could be responsible for these murders, given the fact that all the 4 of them are female victims, that all been killed in totally, completely random ways, attacks that just came out of the blue. All of them were alone. All of them were completely vulnerable when they were killed. I mean, Madeline, she was in what I would consider the most vulnerable of situations per se. She was with her young kids. That makes you even more vulnerable. Every single one of them had been brutally stabbed to death. 3 was in Denver and 1 was in the neighbouring Adams County, but still in the Denver area. Now, in each instance, not one suspect had been identified. Again, deeply disturbs me, because when you have somebody who is murdered, people talk. If you're interviewing enough people around the area, if you're listening out for the smallest details, people talk. Loose lips. And if you're interviewing enough people, you often will find that somebody of a certain description is mentioned on multiple occasions, and then suddenly you're drawing it down into a smaller pool of information and possibility. And in the end, you come up with a potential suspect, an EFIT, whatever it is. But at this time, in spite of all of these heinous, horrific, random killings that all linked because they have the same MO, not one suspect's identified. I will say, I was looking at this, and at the time the Denver police were completely overwhelmed and inundated with an unprecedented number of homicides in their jurisdiction. I guess we could say they didn't have enough manpower. That was why they weren't linking these. But I would arguably say, if there are killings that all meet the same MO, why are we not looking at jumping and connecting them? Because that seems to me to be the most obvious thing to do. Overwhelmed, unprecedented amount of homicides or not. This is something that tells a story. Women are being murdered just walking to work or feeding the kids breakfast. This has to be so high up on the list of priorities that somebody should be swooping in and saying, these dots need connecting. And if it's not bad enough that the police are not actually linking this clear MO and deciding that they've got a serial killer on the loose, they were also unaware of the fact that they've actually got a murder suspect walking around their city who has been walking around their city for quite a long time, in spite of the fact that they wanted a connection with another murder. It was obviously an unrelated case. It actually happened in Texas and it happened over a decade earlier. But nonetheless, they had a murder suspect at large in their city. And no one noticed. Now, that suspect in question was 30-year-old Joseph Michael Irvin. There was still a statewide murder warrant out for his arrest. So I don't know. Maybe I'm being cruel, guys. Maybe I'm being a little bit unfair. Maybe I'm expecting too much of the police. Or maybe, I don't know, they're just not doing a really good job right now. Particularly when it comes down to solving the women's murders of individuals randomly attacked in the most heinous of ways and bringing that killer to justice, as opposed to just accepting that there were no suspects. How could there possibly have been no suspects? How could nobody have seen anything come on? So let's look at Joe Ervin. Well, he's born on the 25th of June, 1951. And I'm going to be honest with you, not a lot is known about his past. But what I did find out was that he'd been a really aspiring, successful American football star at high school. But any of those aspirations to go further and become a true success basically ended because of his actions. His whole career was curtailed by what could be described as senseless, violent behaviour. And he was still a teenager when this plays out. So we get to the night of the 8th of August 1969. An 18-year-old Irvin at this point with a mate. They're hanging around near Berry Bowl Bowling Alley. That's in Fort Worth, Texas. And Irvin spots a parked car and just goes over and approaches it, which is a little bit weird. I don't know about you guys. I'm all for being socially conscious. I smile at people when they walk past me in the street. I chat if I'm buying something from a shop. But I've never been in a car park and thought to myself, I'll just have a wander over, knock on the window, have a natter, might meet somebody nice. You know, that's not kind of the normal social experience. But Irvin spots this car, goes over, and the driver of that car is Larry Holt. And he has a passenger in the car at the time, 21-year-old Rodney Gene Bonham. Now, both of those boys were students at Tarrant County Junior College. And they had just gone, like you or I would go, to meet the mates. They wanted to meet the friends at that bowling alley, have a nice night together. Irvin just walks up to the driver's side, leans through the open window, speaks to the occupants, although what was actually said is unclear because what plays out understandably makes no sense, and certainly the individuals involved were unlikely to have kind of made sense of what was playing out, what was said before, because it's chaos in a moment. Literally after he arrives, knocks on that window, starts talking to them, everything goes wrong. So the belief is he either asked if they were meeting someone or potentially offered them a bottle of beer. So Rodney politely just says, oh, we're just meeting friends inside. And then suddenly, without any warning whatsoever, Irvin just takes out a pistol and shoots Rodney in the neck. And then he turns his attention to Larry and he says to him he's going to shoot him if he doesn't do as he said. Larry's completely blindsided, of course, but he says he'll comply, but he's clever. What do we say? What do we always say when I'm talking about these cases? Do not comply. So whilst Irvin and his friend are distracted, he actually manages to escape through the passenger side door and he runs into the bowling alley for help. And at this point, Irvin and his friend flee the scene. I cannot compute, and I'm sure that none of you can compute, that moment that that poor boy watching his friend be shot, knowing that his life is at risk, how he has to think so quickly. How do I get away from this? How do I move away from this horror scene? How do I save myself? But my God, at least he was thinking on his feet in that moment and he managed to get away. Now, poor Rodney, of course, he's been utterly critically injured. He ends up getting rushed to hospital, but his injuries are so severe and he actually died 4 days later. Now, when that news of his death is made public, what's again completely bizarre is that Irvin literally contacts the victim's dad. He said, I'm sorry he's dead, but we all have to go sometime. I'm sorry I shot him. Now, I mean, that's an interesting statement. Because on one level, there's an apology. I'm sorry he's dead. So I acknowledge that it must be bad for you that he's no longer living. But hey, we all have to go sometime, right? I'm sorry I shot him. It's flippant, it's glib, it's insincere, and I don't think in any way, shape or form he's actually getting in contact with the father to apologise. I think he's just letting the father know that he's free, he's done it, and he's no intention of being brought to justice. It's actually a power play, because he's letting his father know this. I know you, but you don't know me. I killed your son, but I'm still walking around. Can you imagine how that would be for that poor boy's father, dealing with the throes of grief, dealing with the horror of loss, and knowing that this individual on the end of the phone fully knows what they've done and has absolutely no consideration for the impact on his family, but has absolutely no intention to turn himself in? That would be so distressing. Now, initially, and I don't know, unsurprisingly it seems, because the police not really having any suspects seems to be the name of the day today, doesn't it? Apparently, yeah, initially they're like, I don't know who this is. Really? It happened at a bowling alley? There were 2 suspects. One of the witnesses lived, just throwing it out there. But they feel like it's just this random attack. It's completely senseless killing, of course, but they don't know who's done it. However, after a bit more investigating, what was the investigating? Was it like just maybe asking the victim to describe the person who did it and then maybe putting something out for the public? I just despair when I hear about this kind of shoddy investigation, I really do. But when they finally start to more thoroughly investigate, Irvin is identified as the prime suspect. So then they put out a statewide warrant for his arrest, and people are issued with the potential reward of $650 if they turn him in. But Irvin knows he's coming, so he's already fled. He's gone 700 miles to Denver, Colorado, and it's here that he settles and thinks, you know what? I need to do something about my identity. I need to think about the reality that somebody is going to be looking for me in connection with this murder. I'm never going to get caught. I don't want to go to prison for this crime, so I need to change my name. So he changes his name to Joe Michael Irvin. I mean, don't know about you guys. We are dealing with a criminal mastermind, aren't we? I shall change my name. What shall I change my name? My name is Joseph Michael Irvin. I shall call myself Joe Michael Irvin. Sorry? Sorry, what? Your name is Joseph Michael Irvin, and you're actually making the effort to disguise yourself by calling yourself Joe Michael Irvin. Wow. This doesn't look good for those investigators, does it? This guy doesn't even know how to change his name effectively and could, on paper, seem, sound, and of course in physicality, look like the person that they're looking for. But who am I to judge? Who am I to judge what could be considered disastrous policing? Anyway, seems to do the trick, bizarrely. Who knew? I might change my name to Emma Louise Kenny, as opposed to Kenny. Kenny! That would work. Or maybe Emma Lou Kenu. No one will connect me. Absolutely no one in the world. I'll be able to do what I want and just get away with everything. Maybe if I don't know, go to Texas or Denver, that's a possibility. Anyway, even though he's got this new name and you would think, well, he's on the run, he doesn't want to draw attention to who he is, it doesn't stop him being criminal at all. So he's not even concerned about the fact that he's got this prior outstanding charge or potential charge. He feels that he's done enough just, changing a couple of letters in his name to just get away with any future criminal behaviour. And it's weird because he kind of does. So he gets really well acquainted with the criminal justice system because in Colorado over the next few years, he ends up being free to continue offending at a pretty prolific rate. He wasn't at any point, in spite of being brought in when he committed crimes, connected to that outstanding Texas murder warrant. It's bizarre. And rather than keep that low profile like I was talking about, if you think you've managed to get away with something, that awful behaviour just continues and continues, and they are high-level crimes. So between 1917 and 1977, he's arrested for rape, burglary, assault with a deadly weapon, child sexual abuse. And you know what? In spite of those truly grave and truly heinous crimes, because, you know, they are the worst of the worst, aren't they? You don't get to be more of a horrific example of a human predator than being a rapist, a child abuser, somebody who assaults individuals with deadly weapons. They are right at the top of the violent spectrum, and they should be going to prison, I don't know, for 700,000 years. Throwing it out there. I think we all agree on this point now, don't we? But no, he manages to avoid serious prison sentences, because what he does instead is he spends periods of time at the Colorado State Hospital. And this is because he's really good at pleading diminished responsibility, which, with respect, is a pretty damn difficult thing to do in America. It really is. I may occasionally joke when we see investigators fail to link crimes, or where there is certain lack of diligence in investigating. But when it comes down to the court system, penal system, trying to plead diminished responsibility is pretty tough. The standard is really high, but somehow he manages to do this. So instead of serving time in prison, he serves it in this secure hospital. And after only a few months of treatment, bear in mind, rape, child abuse, what are we talking about here? A few months of treatment. Who is smoking what crack when making those decisions? So they release him. He reoffends again. And I mean, he reoffends really quickly. Then he just, again, oh, I'm sorry, I have diminished responsibility. Gets sent back to hospital, gets released, starts again. Just this vicious cycle, this offending behaviour that is clearly a pattern, isn't changing. In fact, it's probably becoming worse because the consequences are so minor for him. And yet he's using this card again and again and again. Oh, I wasn't actually sane when I committed this crime. And then they're spending a very small amount of time treating him and saying he's fine. But he's not fine. If you go back into society and you offend again, particularly high-level offences, you should be locked up potentially for the rest of your life, because your life is not as important as an individual out there who will be a potential victim. And that's also about keeping the person who's dealing with the diminished responsibility safe as well. Because, hey, if you're not compos mentis when you're out there, anything could happen to you or a person that you might choose as a victim. So this should have been dealt with. Now, despite this regular incarceration with the criminal justice system in Colorado, Ervin at no point is ever linked to that outstanding murder warrant in Texas. Apparently, his date of birth had been inputted incorrectly. So when it went onto the National Crime Information Computer System, they put it in wrong. So this error, along with the little change of his surname, that just basically helped him stay off the radar. So in spite of the fact they've been caught for all these other things, he wasn't actually captured at that point for the killing in Texas. Now, this led to him being released on bail multiple times. Bear in mind, released multiple times when wanted for a murder in another state. And when he was released from the hospital the final time, he was as far from rehabilitated as you could even begin to imagine. He is a guy who's played the system, rigged the system, been helped along by mistakes in the system. This is somebody whose consequences have not been harsh or hard. Why would he change his behaviour? He's just able to carry on with this horrible crime spree. And this crime spree had deadly consequences. End of. We get to the early hours of the 27th of June, 1981. This is in Aurora, Colorado, and we've got 26-year-old police officer Deborah Sue Core. She's just patrolling alone. I have issues with that. Please do not for 1 minute think that I believe women are weaker, are not possibly capable of being police officers. I'm not saying that. I just struggle when a female officer is patrolling alone. I actually struggle a lot when male officers are patrolling alone. I think that they are vulnerable and they are at risk a lot of the time. But I think that females, just because of our physical scenario in comparison with men, it makes it more difficult for us to defend ourselves. I get it, there'll be some badass women out there who could take down a 6'4", 30-stone bloke because that's just the way they are. But for the most part, somebody like me, I have to use my mouth to get out of things because it wouldn't take much for somebody to disarm me or control me or physically aggress me. And so when I think about female officers patrolling alone, I'm always concerned about the risk and vulnerability they're at. They're incredibly brave for putting themselves in those situations. I mean, all people who take up those kind of services are brave because you find yourself in altercations of all types. But she's just going about her business. She'd been in the force for just a year. And her husband was also in the police, so they were a real family who believed in these services. So it gets to 1 a.m. that morning. And again, I'm going to say it, she's on her own at that moment in time. So she stops a car, and the reason she stops that car is because she feels that the driver is likely intoxicated. The man in that car, and again, this sliding doors moment, why that car? Why that copper? Because in that car is a 30-year-old Irvin. Bear in mind, he's still wanted for the murder of Rodney Bonham in Texas 12 years earlier. Now, Deborah, of course, she's completely unaware. She doesn't know she's pulled over. All she is expecting is a routine traffic violation to have happened. She's going to be dealing with that one scenario. She just thinks that she's going to go over, breathalyze him, see whatever comes out from that. She's new to the force. Like I said, she's working alone. She's armed, but she's highly vulnerable. And the events that then follow, well, if she thought that that was going to be a routine stop, my God, she could not have been further from the truth. The events that followed were mind-bendingly outside of the realms of reality and ration. So Deborah is in the process of handcuffing Irvin, and she had actually managed to get one of the cuffs on him, but then he starts to resist arrest. Understandably, think about how that's going to go for a woman trying to manage a 30-year-old male. So he starts struggling, and that struggle continues. And at this moment in time, she's clever enough and quick enough to actually radio through to request a backup unit. She requests a cage car. So she's obviously saying, look, she wants a cage car because that detains the individual. But she's obviously very concerned about what's playing out. Now, at this moment, 19-year-old Glenn Spice is just driving by, and he sees the struggle. Now, he was a police explorer scout, so sometimes he'd ride along in patrol cars, and the reason for that is he had really big aspirations of becoming a police officer himself. Now, he is a hero. He just wants to make sure that that police officer is being helped, so he stops the car behind Deborah as he gets out to assist. Now, by this point, Deborah is screaming for help, and my God, she's got good reason. Because not only has Irvin been resisting, he's managed to grab her service gun from its holster. Now, as Glenn approaches, he hears 3 shots, one after the other. All 3 bullets hit Deborah at point-blank range. 2 of them were headshots. Can you imagine that? A routine potential traffic violation, and we're suddenly dealing with a deadly assault on a police officer. Now, hearing the gunfire, Glenn tries to duck behind his patrol car, but Irvin shoots him, and one of the bullets strikes him in the back. Irvin then flees the scene in his car, and Glenn tries to move, but he couldn't. Can you imagine where that person would be in that moment? This is played out in such quick time. It was just a routine traffic stop. And now one officer is dead, another officer is badly injured. Now, Deborah was at the time still to some degree alive, so they rush her to hospital. She's in this critical condition, but she dies just a few hours later. She was Aurora's first officer killed in the line of duty. Thankfully, Glenn did survive. He's a real hero. He knew that Deborah was in trouble and he wasn't afraid to go and help her. But what a loss. Now you can imagine this is an officer who's been killed. And Deborah's husband's in the force as well. So this is personal. And police always want to investigate and bring people to justice. Of course they do. But this is personal. This is one of their own. And they're going to fight tooth and nail to make sure that the person who did this is brought to justice. So Deborah's police colleagues, they quickly traced Irvin's license plate. And this means that they know where his apartment is in Aurora. So they go to arrest him. This is just a short time later. And when they actually find him, they find that he's attempting to saw off the handcuff. Now, even though he's banged to rights, the police are there, it's game over. It isn't as far as Irvin's concerned. So even at this point, in spite of the fact that they know who he is, what he's done, he thinks there's still a chance that he can get away. So he just tries to evade the officers by jumping from the 3rd-story window. But soon he's apprehended. I think it's such a shame when people like this don't fall and damage themselves grotesquely. I genuinely mean that. But I guess there's a few reasons why he's throwing himself from the window. First of all, that doesn't seem very compos mentis. It very much matches up with his prior opportunities that he's taken to suggest it is not in the right state of mind. Because who would throw themselves out of a 3rd-story window, and so on and so forth. But personally, for the police, this isn't really going to cut any chap. It really isn't, because he's killed one of their officers. So when they catch him, they take him to hospital, they check him over, and then he's taken into police custody. He was probably fine because he probably landed on his head. And where there's no sense, there's no feeling, is there? Now, the authorities really quickly establish that Irvin's also wanted in Fort Worth, Texas, on a murder warrant. About time, about time. At the time, he's also free on bail because he'd been involved in a sexual assault charge in Denver. So they realise now this is not just one of those scenarios that has gone horribly wrong. This individual has got previous convictions, he's wanted for potential murder, and he's got sexual violations that he has carried out and is even, at that current time, out on probation for. This is a high-level violent offender. He's indicted on charges of first-degree murder and attempted murder in relation to the Aurora shootings. And at this point, they placed him in solitary confinement at the Adams County Jail. Now, it's during this period of time, it's an evening routine check, he's found hanged in his cell on the 1st of July 1981. This is 4 days after the shootings. And he actually left a note confessing to killing Deborah. I'm just going to throw it out there, Irvin. We didn't need a confession. We had a witness, we had your license plate, we had all the information leading to the apartment, and we also now have a consolidated approach to connecting crimes that you've previously been involved with. You didn't need to leave a note. The crime you carried out was note enough. But this is what he does. He hangs himself in his cell. It annoys me. Personally, I think he'll have got a very quick lift to hell, genuinely. Maybe there's different transport opportunities to hell. I don't know. Maybe it's like one of those fairground rides where you get in it and you know it's going to drop really, 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 really fast. And as soon as they close the door and you're in there, you realise it's a horrible mistake and you really shouldn't do that to yourself. I imagine that that could be a transport method for the devil, just maybe dropping at warp speed for 3,000 years as it gets hotter and hotter and hotter. A bit like reaching the core of the world, you know, of the earth, like when you were doing geography and there's that molten bit in the middle. Yeah, like dropping all the way down there over a very long period of time. Just throwing it out there. I don't care if it's just a lift, it's all the same. You still end up being, shall we say, played with by the devil. It makes me feel happy. But anyway, he doesn't have to serve a prison sentence because he's essentially killed himself. But this is all, remember, at this point it is confessed to, as far as the authorities are concerned. Case gets closed. As far as they're concerned, they've apprehended a cop killer, and they've also, fortunately now, been able to apprehend somebody who could well have killed somebody in Texas because of the outstanding murder warrant. So they believe that because this man had been facing a potential capital murder conviction, he decided, I'm going to end my life in custody. And it would be several decades, and I mean several decades, before the full horrifying truth about Joe Michael Irvin would ever come to light. Now, bear in mind where we started in this case. The brutal murders of Madeline, Dolores, Gwendolyn, and Antoinette. All those murders a few years earlier, every single one of them has remained unsolved. Police believe that they've exhausted every single lead. Cases had then eventually gone cold. But we get to 2004, and at this point, Denver police, they start their cold case unit. I love a cold case unit because no case is ever truly cold. I remember speaking to a police officer, and I've also worked with DCI who will often talk to me, even now, about that reality that when cases go cold, it's not that they've completely been disbanded or ignored or avoided or thrown to the side. It's that there's nothing yet to allow that heat to arrive again, and they're always waiting for those embers to alight. But they need new information or they need new technology. So even though we call them cold cases, they're not really cold cases. They're just cases that haven't yet been solved and are waiting for that heat to arrive. And a lot of departments in the UK and in America, Australia, Western world, and I'm sure in other countries, they've created these cold case units because they're frustrated. They're frustrated about the fact that families were never given closure. And also, they're getting savvy. They're realizing that some of these cases, if they look at them, they'll be able to connect the dots and realize that convicts that they already have in prison were likely responsible, so they can try them for those crimes. Or they'll be able to look at new patterns, which could mean that they actually realize that unlinked cases can be linked, and then they're looking at serial killers and so on and so forth. So it's really important that cold case units are established. So at this point, they start looking at all the prior deaths, and during that following decade, the 4 killings that we've talked about, they were all reviewed multiple times. But it's in 2013, the authorities re-examined the forensic evidence from Madeline and Dolores' murders, and they find a link. They find the same DNA profile of an unknown male. And it's just after this, in 2015, the police establish the same DNA link in Gwendolyn's unsolved murder. So now they've got one person, 3 murders. So then the detectives review Antoinette's case. This is in 2009 and 2011. Now, on each of those occasions, the items of evidence were tested for DNA, but they didn't actually yield any new findings. And it was thought that any of the available sources of DNA had already been used up during the testing process. But investigators tried swabbing an empty glass tube. And it's testament to dog and a bone type of investigation. This, as far as they're concerned, all of the samples that had been used from this victim had already been used up. But they're like, you know what? There's this glass tube, and it did once contain evidence from the victim. So in spite of the fact it wasn't there anymore, they just think about testing it. So they swab it, and they managed to obtain DNA profile from an unknown male. So that profile at this point is uploaded into the FBI's Combined DNA Index Systems. That's called CODIS. And that's October 2018. And it's matched. It's matched the profile of the killer in the 3 Denver stabbings. Finally, after 40 years, it had been established that all 4 murders had been committed by the same perpetrator all along. The police should have been hunting a serial killer. But even though they now know this was one guy, and I imagine that their bellies were just bubbling with fear, because if you imagine that in such a short amount of time, 4 women met their doom by this malevolent monster, and they hadn't linked it, you're going to think, my God, what else has he done? But in spite of knowing that, they still don't know who he is. The perpetrator's identity just remains a mystery. But all that changes. It's always good to be able to say those words, isn't it? All that changes. Really recently, in the summer of 2021. It's at this point, Denver Police Crime Laboratory, they decide to use the latest ancestry DNA profiling techniques. And the whole reason for this is everybody has DNA, right? I have a DNA profile. I have a service that I use. It helps me with a family tree. And I also get to look at all my distant cousins. And if any immediate members of my family join, it connects us. And they don't sell my data. So I'm pretty cool in doing that. But it also opens up this bigger, wider conversation, which is when family members of individual perpetrators align themselves with these DNA sites, it means that investigators can essentially compare that DNA. So they do familial DNA searches. And in this case, they do a familial DNA search of the Texas Criminal Database, which finds a genetic genealogy link to a close biological relative of a suspect living in Texas. So the person that they believe is absolutely 100% guilty of these murders now has a close genetic link to somebody living in Texas. And that's really, really important. So from this point, the police are able to identify Joe Michael Irvin as the potential suspect. It's not confirmed at this point that he is actually the perpetrator, but they have this potential suspect. Now that same Joe Ervin was the guy who was the same guy who'd been wanted for the 1969 murder in Texas and who had killed a cop in 1981. The only problem being, of course, that Irvin had been now dead for 40 years. Burning brightly, one will hope. Smouldering at an incredibly hot temperature. Whilst this case had been cold, Irvin was super, super hot. Anyway, I digress. So they go ahead and they get permission to exhume Irvin's body. He'd been buried in Arlington, Texas. So this happens in January 2022. And they get DNA. It's extracted from his remains. And of course, as we all expected, it's a match. It's a match for that unknown male responsible for the murders of Madeline, Dolores, Gwendolyn, and Antoinette. And of course, that little baby that never even got a breath of life because of this man's actions. Now, it transpired, in fact, that when Gwendolyn Harris's body was found in December 1980, Irvin was literally living in an apartment nearby and about a block away from the Polo Club Lounge bar when she was last seen alive. So they're even able to see that he's in the locality. Now, after he was released from Colorado State Hospital, that's when Irvin had gone ahead and stabbed 4 women to death. How appalling, right? That Irvin was released from Colorado State Hospital for horrendous crimes, really horrendous crimes, but was just able to use this loophole to walk away from the reality of his terrible, predatory potential. And that's why 4 other women and a police officer ended up being murdered. That's all in 3 years. All of those deaths happened. 4 women and 1 female police officer. All killed by this man because he was allowed to just walk free. The errors in that criminal justice system had basically allowed a dangerous, violent man, a wanted murderer, to just walk the streets. It cost the lives of at least, and I say at least, 5 innocent women. I think we can likely agree that this man probably never stopped killing. He started at 18. He had years, over a decade. And we saw how quickly he killed. We saw the fact that he was comfortable and confident doing it in random places in broad daylight. Why wouldn't he have murdered more? And what's really grating is that he took his own life, which meant that he escaped justice. He wasn't prosecuted for any of the 6 killings that he is believed to have committed. But fortunately, at least we have his identity. At least we know it was him. At least we can link it to those 4 unsolved murders, offer at least a tiny bit of closure to the victim's family. Even though, to be fair, that closure probably came 40 years too late for them. Now, the resolutions of these cases are all down to the actions of 26-year-old police officer Deborah Sue Court. I want that to be known. Without her risking her life in the line of duty, being killed in the line of duty in 1981, you know, when she pulled over Irvin on that fateful night, she could not have known that he was already wanted for murder. She had absolutely no idea that he was also a ruthless serial killer. You know, there were no signs that Irvin, at any point, can we be honest, would have even considered to stop killing of his own accord. He was never going to do that. You know, even though he'd been wanted for the 1969 killing of Rodney Bonham, let's be clear, he'd avoided any kind of apprehension, he'd continued killing. Authorities hadn't even joined the dots, hadn't realised the serial killer was on the loose, and Irvin was not even on the radar for the other unsolved murders. In fact, it's most likely that this man would have been a serial killer for the rest of his life. As long as he had liberty, he would take innocent lives. It's unbelievably tragic for me that Deborah, that police officer who was killed in the line of duty, even though it is horrific that she lost her future, that she died so young, it was that woman's sacrifice that without a doubt saved many, many more lives. It's Deborah who solved this case. She lost her life doing so, but we should pay testament to the reality of the impact that her sacrifice has had, because it really has saved so many others. This case is one of those that has really stayed with me since hearing about it, because I think about the families denied justice. I think about the decades waiting to know whether somebody will be brought to justice for your child's murder. I think about those girls growing up without their wonderful mum. I think about the baby that never got to have their life because of this monster. And this case has stayed with me because of the fact that it makes me think about all of those criminals, the rapists, the serial killers, the child molesters, the con artists, the individuals who come into our society and steal our safety and then believe they've got away with it, sometimes for decades, quietly thinking that they outsmarted investigators, quietly thinking that they're better, brighter, more superior to people like you and I. But all the whilst in the back of our minds, that creeping awareness that those cold cases are never truly cold. And as they sit there watching their TVs, driving their cars to work, being in their relationships, smugly thinking that their freedom is assured, like I said, those embers begin to burn. And as DNA and ancestry and new forensic developments arrive, every single day of freedom is one day less of theirs. And that keeps me warm at night. Because in the end, they may get away with it for a while, but in this day and age, they most likely won't get away with it forever. Thanks so much for watching, guys. I appreciate you massively. Apologies for the dog barking in the back of the room. He slithered off my lap and then just decided to find another space and place to reside, just so I wouldn't quite know where he was, and also couldn't control him when he decided to just start randomly barking. He just wanted to get involved. Wookiees like that. Give me a like, give me a comment, share your thoughts. I appreciate every single one of you. And remember, do not comply. Be safe.